that there is this
Whoop.
that there is this system, this version of the language that those who can achieve that like are there is this sort of like denotationally like better form of the language that we all sort of like think is out there. And I think in that sense, I mean, that's where you see like that kind of ideology sort of reinforced by officially in educational institutions, implicitly in media, and in government institutions. So again, like it really seems like even though we don't have an official national language, but we still sort of de facto operate as if we do. And that anyway, they could keep going on that, but I think hopefully we made the point.
Yeah, I think, part of the the thing is, yes, we have a language, a national usage called English, and I guess the question then is the evolution of that language because of the introduction of immigrant languages, let me call it that. And I know there's basically no country whose language hasn't changed because of conquest, trade, or whatever through all of history. But it appears to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that in modern times, English is one of the most conglomerate languages, if you want to call it that, or language where it's still pulling from other languages. Is that my imagination, or is that pretty true compared to other languages, let's say in Europe or Latin America or whatever, that we really do absorb more?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's anything particular about English as a language as much as the history of the people who are using English. And English has always, or at least has very, very long time, um, like you said, absorbed contact from a lot of different languages. And so, I mean, I will say like this is slightly out of my wheelhouse as someone who doesn't study just like historical linguistics or language contact, but English is a language that has a lot of influence and not only does right now, but it has throughout its entire time. I mean, essentially, if you think about the birth of English as a group of these, Germanic dialects that then go away from, where we consider modern day Germany to what we consider like modern day England. And as they do that, they separate from the other people in their community who speak that language. And then they get introduced to new languages that are already going to start changing that. And then that just like keeps happening in cycles. I mean, especially through like if you get into the 11th century with the Norman conquest, and you have a like a massive influx of Latinate influence via French, although the Latinate influence on English precedes that as well. And then you have just a series of like other contexts around that time, like influence from Arabic with like, centuries before. Then you've got like Spanish and Italian, and all these languages are constantly informing the way that English has taken shape. And then as English goes, as the British Empire kind of went out and English really spreads across the world, every new context that it goes into, it gets influenced by. I mean, and part of this is the emergence of what scholars have referred to as world Englishes as well. But one thing that I think that this sort of points to is that with any language, and especially with the English as a primary exemplar potentially of this, there is no single version of a language. Like it's really when we say English, if we pretend that we're referring to one thing, that's a massive abstraction to begin with. And so, but it's really interesting how we kind of pretend that it's sort of singular. We pretend that it's homogenous. We pretend that it's static. That's part of what Jane Hill, a scholar who has studied a lot about standard language ideology, kind of talks about how we endow languages like this with this kind of respectable histories that are at odds with kind of like how facts are playing on the ground. So I will say I don't know enough to quantify to say like, is it changing at a rate that's very different? I don't know, but I think this has just been much the story of English for a very, very long time. But like you're saying, and I think alluding to, is that when you look at these sort of junctures of contact, it's not neutral as to like what people see as English and what people see as sort of not English, or whether or not people perceive this as natural change or a deterioration. There was another phrase that or word that came up in the movie as well. That is not a neutral sort of thing, and it's interesting to look and say like, well, what do people accept and why? Those are bigger questions.
Just a reminder, I don't have to ask all the questions. We don't have that big a group. You can certainly message one. Oh, here's one. But I think we can also, if you feel you'd like to unmute to ask a question, please feel free to do it because the group is not that terribly large. So, Kazit, I read somewhere that at one time the powers that be in the United States considered making German a national language. Any truth to that?
Thanks, Kay, for the question, and I also appreciate your prior question, which is desserts question mark.
Oh,
Um,
that's we normally talk a little bit about desserts we bring if we have something in the subject, and I didn't know about the time thing, so we didn't do that at this point. But go, yeah, if you'd answer Kay's question, that'd be great.
As far as I know, yes, this is not a history that I have looked deeply into, but I have heard that German was a language that people did push to make a national language, albeit unsuccessfully. Um, so as far as I know, yes, I think so.
Okay.
Cliff might
Any,
know.
okay. Before I go on any further questions, okay. Talking about the kind of, oh, I'm sorry, Suzanne?
Yes. Being a psychologist, I look at this from a psychological perspective, being married to a British man, being well aware, having spent a lot of time in England about the class system. And I saw Lawrence Fox and the other guy as being, we are upper crud. We're so much better than the rest of you, and you don't have a degree. How dare? How dare that we allow you to take this on? And they were so upset that he didn't have initials, that they were going to do everything they could to make sure it was a failure.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I appreciate that. And another thing that stood out to me in the movie as well, I don't remember the exact line, but at some point somebody makes a side comment about how he won't even pretend to hide his Scottish accent, like so as to not offend their sensibilities. And yeah, that's a really good point. Is that a lot of times, like people sort of position themselves as experts on language in a way that is very classist and elitist. And there's certainly a lot of classism, like even in the U.S. today. And depending on like also how one sees classism and racism interacting, that those things are kind of cooperating to and a lot in language playing a huge role in that.
I'm sorry to go ahead along with what Suzanne said. What I found was very interesting is, of course, they picked definitions from classics, among which was Shakespeare, the man who made up more words and phrases than any English author in history. So it was elitist. It was correct, I shouldn't say, to the elitists to use Shakespeare as a reference for usage. And yet here's a guy who's just making stuff on because it fits into his the rhythm of his iambic pentameter, or because he just liked the sound of the words or whatever. So it was kind of interesting, exactly what Suzanne's saying. The defenders of the pure language were using as one of the bases a man who didn't have any respect for the pure language, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point that they bring out. I mean, one, that usage-based approach was really grounded in literature, which is a very interesting technique to go about. You can think about another approach that is usage-based, but doesn't necessarily go towards literature, is the urban dictionary. Urban dictionary, like, is something where like people are really trying to track stuff in current usage in real time, which is, both of these are phenomenally like difficult tasks and approaches to do. But the idea that usage is still sort of like not necessarily how everybody is talking per se, it could be, but documented usage. I mean, of course, there's an advantage to that, because if you think about, or as I think about how difficult it would be to not only like come up with like, let's capture every word that we know, and let's capture the meaning of everything we know, but let's trace the history of that. Part of the reason that that is available in a language like English is because of like written records can go pretty time deep, I would say, like in pretty consistently. And so using literature is advantageous in that sense, if that's one of the aims. I see, Maureen had your hand up for a while. I wanted to.
Hang on just one second. There is a typed
Oh,
in
there's one
question
in
that
chat.
I'm gonna, give me just a second from the chat. There's a really good question. You've gotten away from the science of linguistics into the politics of language. The movie touches on the science of dictionary making, but doesn't put the science into the 19th century advances in historical linguistics that informed Murray and the OED.
Yeah, I would say I completely agree. I mean, the movie doesn't touch on that clip at all. And this is probably something, so I don't know if everybody knows, but do they know that you're a linguist? They know that you're a
Sorry, I have to unmute myself now. It's a deep, dark secret.
It's no longer a dark secret now.
But yeah, they really don't get into some of these other aspects. As people were really understanding relatedness of different languages, there's a point, I think, where kind of like back, Suzanne, you had made the point about how people were scoffing in the movie about Murray's like lack of paper credentials. And then he kind of says, well, I know like all of these different languages, and kind of gives this an amazing litany of kind of like a background of everything that he had self-taught. But yeah, that kind of like barely, I think, just begins to nod to some of these. That's the only point, Cliff, that I recognize in the movie where they really kind of gave a little bit of a nod to that. I didn't see much of it elsewhere.
No, but I think that's one of the cruxes of the movie. And as a fellow linguist, it's hard to not geek out on this linguistic stuff. But just to mention that Murray had been to Germany and had seen the German work on the German dictionary. And the movie refers to that a little bit, but it doesn't draw the connection to historical linguistics, why work on a German dictionary would inform work on the English dictionary. And the point to that is that the scholars in the 19th century were concerned in not just tracing the history of words in English, but tracing the history of words in Proto-Indo-European, which is the family of languages that the Germanic language branch belongs to, as well as the Romance branch. And Indo-European goes back roughly 6,000 years into the Iron Age and prehistory. So the tracing of the origin of words has tremendous implications about the tracing of the intellectual evolution of the Indo-European speakers across several continents. And the constructions of the dictionaries were built in part to inform that 19th century work on tracing the history of English and German back to its ancestral roots in Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah, and if you have not looked at the Oxford English Dictionary, you should. I mean, and whether you can get a paper copy or you can browse these, because the amount of like those historical linkages that they put into many of the entries is really phenomenal and fascinating to look into. But like Dr. Pai is saying, I mean, essentially like this explosion of historical linguists happens not that long before the proposal for the Oxford English Dictionary in the first place, or I forget the longer name that it originally had. But you have like in the late 1700s to the like throughout the 1800s and the 19th century, an explosion in historical linguistics that would really make possible a lot of these historical connections that people were wanting to make.
And now we've learned that he isn't just an expert on wines. Go ahead, Shelley.
Was that impetus in part due to things like the discovery and decoding of the Rosetta Stone and things like, ancient languages that had gone out of usage?
I don't know. So,
Is that why they wanted to capture what English was, you know, at that time at least,
I
without?
think that certainly opened up like some for people's ability to decipher some of these things that people were thought that were undecipherable. I'm not sure how much like whether or not this really propelled some of this kind of dictionary work, but it certainly I would be surprised if it was unrelated.
Maureen, you had a question?
Yeah, you said you also have a department of grammar nerds, and I wondered and this is sentence structure more than an actual word itself, but as things start to change and become accepted, there has to be various points where grammarians just cringe. Um, it, and I mean, and I guess there comes a point where they have to say, just concede to the fact that that's the way it is. Does that happen? I
Yeah,
mean, I've
I would
lived long enough that I cringe at some of the changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly different levels. There's like, you know, on one extreme, like a person who just cringes at everything, and then everybody kind of has personal preferences of things that might make one cringe. There's a story I believe that traces to Penny Eckert, and now I'm getting really nervous because I see that this was recorded, and I should have looked this up. But Penny Eckert is a very famous sociolinguist from Stanford, and she talked about teaching some of the sort of properties that were associated with what has been sometimes termed Valley Girl speak, for example. And one of those includes rising intonation laid over a declarative sentence. So, cross-linguistically, there are lots of different ways that languages will use intonation patterns when somebody's asking a question. And for many speakers of English, you might speak a variety where if you're going to ask a question that has yes or no as the answer, like, hey, did you get the book? You're going to rise that intonation as like you terminate that utterance. But if you say you got the book, that's gonna fall. But some people might say you got the book, and that's rising with that. And that's one where historically a lot of people have loved to hate that kind of phenomenon, but it's become really, really widespread. And even like today, you can turn on different national media, and people who had no association with that kind of like origin point are going to use that. And so I think to a certain extent, depending on the grammarian, I've read some people who just double down. No matter what, like these things are wrong and they will always be wrong. And then on the other hand, you see some who still kind of take an approach that maybe there is some version of thing that we can sort of like try to ascribe to, but that fluctuates. And then you'll see people adjust that over time. Yeah.
One of the questions I had is we all know we're always adding words into our language in the sense of usage of certain things becoming more common. Do we eliminate words, or in terms of a linguistics point of view, do we eliminate words, or do we just call them now archaic?
You mean from a
From
lexicography
either a
perspective?
dictionary or from an academic point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would have to guess a little bit from the lexicography perspective. I mean, the dictionary
Sorry.
projects that I've been involved in are much smaller in scope. I mean, right now, I'm actually working on a grammar book for a language that we'll be finishing this year. And at the end of that, I don't really even have like a full dictionary. It's just a glossary that will likely have about 1,000 words, and that already seems like a massive undertaking for me. But I think it partly has to do with the aims of the dictionary. I mean, like any kind of product, like everybody kind of has to think about like who is this for? Like what is the use? And the Oxford English Dictionary has kind of, my understanding is that it's always sort of made it out to be like the authority on English, and that it would be kind of like preserving as well as like intaking constantly. And so in that sense, in that kind of dictionary approach where your goal is like essentially don't ever let go of anything. If there's some version of a word like elsewhither that we don't ever say anymore, you would not eliminate it. You would just mark it as archaic. But if you think about other dictionaries where their aim is a little bit more like, I want to capture the essence of like what people are saying right now, that dictionary would in effect, serve to eliminate a word because they're not as interested in kind of like having a permanent record, so to speak. So I'd say probably, dictionaries are going to do a little bit of both of them, depending on what their aim is and who their audience is.
Gotcha. All right, Cliff, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it really is worthwhile taking a look at the entries in the Oxford English Dictionary. And one of the things they do is use a little cross or a dagger to mark the obsolete words or obsolete senses of a word. And it's important to recognize one of the really nice things the Oxford English Dictionary does is not only have a list of words, but for each word, it has probably 10 or 15 at least, at a minimum, different senses or different uses of the word. And that's why they were so keen on finding out how each word is used, because the usages, the context in which a word is used also change over time. And some of those usages become obsolete. And then there are new usages that are developed for each word over particular sorts of time. So it's not as though a whole word is lost or added to the dictionary at any time. The context in which words are used are also changing constantly. And this is what Phil was talking about, is how difficult it is for linguists to keep track of all of the different contexts in which a word is used. You don't quite know the right word to use for an occasion, so you just pull another word out and use that, and it seems to work okay for most of the time. And that's why you can trace over time how those usages evolve to the point where the same word can change its meaning quite radically over time.
Jack, are you able to turn on screen share for participants?
Sure. Hang on just 1 second and I will do that. Oh. Okay, I'm sorry. I had a little trouble finding because it's condensed on my screen.
Sure.
Just give me a second here. Whoop. I did the wrong thing. Hang on a minute. Sorry. Oh, there it
What?
is. I'm sorry.
While,
Give me
while
just
you're,
go. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was, you were talking earlier about American, and I remember a really wonderful series from probably 30 years ago that was on PBS. I think it was Jim Lair. Do you speak American?
Yeah.
And it was, I haven't been able to find it. I'm assuming it's still out there someplace, but the library doesn't have it anyway.
Yeah, KU's, I can't remember if that's one that KU's eGARC has had. I don't know if PBS ever put that online. There may be pirated versions on YouTube or something like that. Yeah, it's a really great series, and they even have some. They used to, at least a couple of years ago, had a website support with a lot of extra information. If you're interested in that kind of thing, there's a group from North Carolina State University, the Language and Life Project. Has some similar things. A movie they came out with, or a documentary they came out with a couple of years ago, which is really great, called Talking Black in America. And they've done several really good things too. But yeah, Do You Speak American is a really nice one.
Screen share's on. Yep, you got it.
Okay, all right, yeah. So so I was just gonna pull as an example of something like this. I will say I have a really old computer, so sometimes it's not very friendly. But this is a great example of something Cliff was just talking about, and these sort of symbols. So this is the word nice, which I think came from Old French originally, but it's been around, and this is a great example of a meaning that's gone obsolete, even though the word itself is still quite in usage. But so about 600 years ago, if you called somebody nice, you can see this over here. if you were referring to a person as nice, you'd be calling them foolish or ignorant. And that clearly is not what that word means today. And then, as you can see here, this is the kind of example of what you see them trying to do in the movie, which is really fascinating, where they're trying to document not just an attestation of the word, but the attestation of the word with this particular meaning. And then you can see, several of these meanings for nice have gone obsolete, which I think is really fascinating. It meant strange or rare, shy, coy, eventually slender and thin. And then you finally kind of like get to, agreeable in nature over a long period of time. I mean, so this word has been around, it says like circa 1300. So this is a word that's been around for 700 years. And in that time, it's gone through, quite a bit of meanings. And the version that we know has only been around for about 250 years, at least based on sort of textual documentation.
Well, okay, I promised a little bit of a chat about the movie, but if we have any other questions, if not, I'd like you guys to unmute and talk about the other aspects of the movie, the asylum, the psychology, the relationship between the people, the whole Civil War situation. All of that, I think, is phenomenal as the linguistics part of it. So, Maureen?
Yeah, quickly, but before time runs out, I just wanted to mention the new museum in Washington, D.C., Planet Word. And it's just astounding. And it's even kid friendly. And the minute you walk in, they have a giant screen showing you where so many of our words came from and what nation they came from. And I just want to recommend it if anybody is ever in DC. It's amazing.
If you're in DC, it's not too far from the mall. It's in an old historic school building. It's only been open about 3 years, less than 3 years, I
Less than
think.
that.
2 years maybe. 3 floors of language, not just English, and they touch on almost everything we've talked about today. So it was really, really a phenomenal experience if you're in the area.
And it
Okay.
is entertaining. It's not just
Right. Yes. It's very hands-on and very modern and electronic as well. So
Where did
there's
you
some
say that
crazy
is?
stuff like you can read a book and the book comes alive in front of you, just like in the air where there's some screen there that you don't see. Kind of crazy. All right.
Maureen, where did you say that is?
It's in DC. It's in
Okay.
Washington, DC.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the name of it is Planet Word.
Ah.
Okay. All right. Feelings about the movie. You liked it. You hated it. It was crazy. I want to go to that insane asylum. It was so much fun. What?
I'll give it a 5.
I would say that I was amazed at the acting because the main character, okay, can't remember his name now.
Which one? The professor?
Minor
The professor
Yeah.
was
Murray.
played
Murray.
by, see, my mind just went blank.
Murray.
10.
And anyway, I didn't even know that it was him. I mean, he did such a good job acting.
Oh,
And-
Mel Gibson.
Mel Gibson.
Yeah, Mel Gibson.
Yes.
And the same with Sean Penn, and then even the professor's wife. I mean, her emotional expressions and her change of the way she sort of had a change of heart at times. I just felt like their acting was really very, very competent, very good.
Yeah.
One of the things I'd like to comment, what a phenomenal piece of luck that the right doctor was in the right place at the right time in an environment where that would almost never have happened had it not been for him. And it's a true story. So that's, when you think about it in our terms, it's like, oh, great, this guy said, but when you think about the time period, in almost any institution with almost any other doctor, they'd be drilling holes in his head instead. I mean, a little far-fetched, but pretty phenomenal chance.
Not far-fetched at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, lobotomies.
Yeah.
I
I also
really,
found the PTSD, to call
Yeah.
it a modern term, situation of the effect of the Civil War on a
Mm.
doctor. And there's been other books written just about other doctors who committed suicide and whatever because of what they had to do and how many people died and how many bones and legs and arms they had to cut off, was also a phenomenal but small part of it, but it's very important part of the movie as well.
yeah.
It's amazing that any of them survived mentally from that.
Mm. I felt that the movie touched on all kinds of aspects. The woman that's left with 7 kids and
6.
how she's trying to support herself. Her kids are putting matches in boxes. She's prostituting herself, and she doesn't want to accept the money. And then finally, when I think it was when the ham came at Christmas time, she said, "This might be okay because my kids can't starve." And how we today are dealing with homelessness, with people trying to survive, eke out some kind of existence and find food. I found the superintendent of the asylum, I felt like that was a little bit of a stretch because he was more accepting of the doctor and his PTSD, and I don't think that would have actually happened back then. I mean, that he brought in all the books, that he did all this stuff.
Yeah.
But when he finally was doing whatever the current treatment was for what we know as schizophrenia, then I thought that was his true colors, that's how we used to treat people in mental institutions. And if it hadn't been for the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and JFK and Robert Kennedy, we would still probably have asylums, but they wanted community health facilities, and that's our problem now, because that's why we have so many people on the street homeless, because we don't care. We're not giving them the proper care.
Brought up a lot of issues, that movie. Okay, any further comments or questions? Questions for either of our 2 linguists that we have joining us tonight?
So Suzanne would say that I would have fit in perfectly with the Oxford professors because I'm hoity-toity and I like to speak proper English and spell words the English way rather than the American way. So
I think there's an entire generation of Americans who speak African American English who would call your English not proper.
I understand that. What I wanted to ask the Professor Philip and the other gentleman is, how is it that it happens in England as well, but how is it that we verbalize nouns? So the typical example is Google was a company and now you Google something. How does that happen, that transition of words changes from being a noun to a verb?
Yeah, that's a really, I mean, so I'm trying to think of not say it in a technical way. I mean, my favorite example of this comes from Calvin and Hobbes, which is my source of literature. I think the statement was verbing weirds language. And English has long had a process. We call it zero derivation. And we have a lot of ways that we can take one particular word and then add something like a suffix to it and then change the category. So if you take like nation and then you start with a noun and you add all, you get an adjective, and you add eyes and you get a verb kind of thing. But we also have had a phenomenon called zero derivation, where essentially you're not adding any piece to it, but you're just changing the category of it. How that happens, the exact process of that is not something that I have like really done a lot of study in, but it really goes back to sort of like usage. I mean, nowadays you see a lot of flexibility with new terms that younger people are using right now. And the categorical flexibility is really, really impressive, because people just take something and like op refers to like opposition or opponent. I've heard that used as a noun. I've heard that used as an adjective. I've heard that used as a verb. And that hasn't even been around that long. So people, English already has this sort of like built-in grammatical components that allow us to have that kind of flexibility. Other languages do too, but maybe the grammatical properties of other languages are a little bit less flexible in just taking a word without any added stuff and changing the category. But English for a long time has been very, very free and liberal in allowing us to do that, which is great.
I'm sure it goes back further than that, but in my lifetime, part of which has been spent in the corporate world, I would blame a lot of the modern making a noun into a verb on the corporate world. I'm not sure why they do it, but it's rampant, and I think it goes along with what I call the alphabetizing of the corporate world, where nobody has a title, they have 3 initials, and if you don't know what that means, you're just not part of the group. Like, we used to have things like vice presidents. Now they have SRQs or something, and God knows what they mean. So I think it's a little bit part of their magic language in the corporate world to exclude people, because that's where I found a lot of nouns becoming verbs. Drove me crazy.
I would just say that this is one perfect place to go back to the Oxford English Dictionary, because you can see just exactly how long people have been converting verbs to nouns and nouns to verbs. It's probably
sure.
hundreds of years.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah. And I'm sure it's because as a short-sighted human being who only lives, that long in the world of the universe, you kind of see what happened to you over the last 50 years is the universe, and you're so
We
wrong.
forget that people 1,000 years ago are doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have
that
the
is
same
funny
corporate
how
interest.
I think it started with the Invent the Wheel Corporation, however.
and then the advent of printing press corporation, maybe, who knows.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Yeah, but that
Well,
process has been around. It's been a feature of English for a very long
yeah.
time.
I still like to blame the business world for stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of think that in my own mind. But I appreciate knowing the truth at the same time.
But with
Any other questions? I don't want to cut us short
I
here.
was also going to ask the professor, so in their watching and listening and reading their students' work, with the advent of texting and shortened speech, how has the quality of writing improved or deteriorated like I think it would?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, I actually get this question a lot. I think it does depend slightly. Your answer to the question depends on whether or not that is a form that signals deterioration or not. I don't see that aspect. I would not say that that's deteriorating the writing. I think that's really just technology. The way that we sort of interact with technology has always influenced the way that we use language, and shorthand for stuff really like even goes back to like, I just mentioned the printing press kind of offhand, but there's a lot of shorthand that printing presses use like for certain words that would repeat with high frequency. And, John McWhorter, a linguist from Columbia University, like has a really great phrase for texting in particular, where he basically, he calls it fingered speech, because he says, finally technology has caught up with us in such a way that we can actually type at the rate that we talk, essentially. And so I get excited about it. I mean, I know texting is now like a little bit older, but you still see some of this kind of like bringing in. I personally don't see it as a type of deterioration. I have other concerns of things that I think are like leading to differential quality, like with AI tending to like and Grammarly tools like this that are sort of built with versions of what good language should, quote unquote, should be, that tend to flatten and homogenize the way that people talk. I've seen that, I would say, affect more having a negative impact than texting and those other kinds of things, personally at least. But
so what you're saying, there is hope for Chris's British hoity-toity, because AI might be incorporating some of that.
It could be. Depends on what they train it on, I guess.
All right. Any other questions? Because if not, go ahead, Shelley.
I was just going to comment that I was wondering if it was a peeve of yours, because it's a peeve of mine, having been brought up to, when I asked a question or my parents, they'd say, go look it up. And I'd have to go look it up in the dictionary or encyclopedia or whatever. And to have people now Google a word for its definition and take the first top definition and ignore all the other possibilities drives me nuts.
Yeah, I think that's kind of akin to the on a word processor, right click and find synonym and just like, spin the wheel of choice kind of thing. I mean, it's interesting to think about how even practices like that are simply part of how language changes naturally, oddly enough. And so like part of the flexibility of language comes from interacting in these kinds of practices, whether we like them or not, I guess.
Okay, I think we'll have to come to a halt. It is 8 o'clock. I want to really thank Dr. Duncan for his contributions this evening. I, for one, learned an awful lot. It was great. I did not make a dessert. My wife suggested alphabet soup since we were talking about language, but that's not really a dessert. So we'll have to go from there. But thank you very much, Dr. Duncan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Cliff, for your contributions. Really appreciate it. And I hope other people learned as much as I did. I thought it was really great. So, Denise, I see a hand. Oh, that's an applause. I'm sorry. So thank you very much. And we'll call it an evening. And we'll see you guys next time on Dessert and Movie, or we'll see you at whatever event that you choose to come to next. Dr. Duncan has sent his email if anybody wants to chat more about it. When we send out the recording, I will follow up with that and put that out for you as well. So have a great evening. We'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.